All power to the people, that's how we proceed. We know they won't give, so we take what we need. All power to the people, we work, we struggle. With the backbone, the brains, and the muscle. Fuck that abstract shit, look around. We got power in our numbers, the politics of crowds. Cause you're more than an individual. And when we get together, it is more than a ritual. To pick away at your wage like a vulture. That's why we need a revolution in our culture. If you spray what we say on the walls, this goes out to you when your tag stands tall. As long as you get involved, all artists for the cause. Hear the people's call. We start at the root, then we bloom. A flower in the concrete that said that it was doomed. So we will reclaim it, the people's reign like a monsoon. In order to survive, we must defy the tomb that tried to divide, conquer from inside. Threading the needle with a needless compromise. Make me see red, that's the blood in my eye. We are under siege behind enemy lines, so get organized. The motive's the political line. We take what works, the rest is left behind. Power to the people, that's how we proceed. We know they won't give, so we take what we need. All power to the people, we work, we struggle. With the backbone, the brains, and the muscle. Power to the people, gotta take back the...
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the International Working Women's Day live stream with myself and Comrade Maya. Before we get into anything else, you will notice that my name is not Thomas right now. Excuse me, but in fact, Ryan, and I will be going by Ryan going forward. So if there's any confusion about that, hopefully this clears it up. I'll probably make an announcement at the start of the next video we post, not just a live stream, but it's official as of now. I'll be going by Ryan going forward. So with that said, welcome everyone joining us from around the world. As I noted, today will be the live stream on International Working Women's Day, which is tomorrow, a very important proletarian and feminist holiday. And which is a site of struggle as the ruling class is trying to co-opt this all the time. So as communists, we need to really fight for this and teach people the true history of this day. And we'll get into some of that a little bit later. I'll introduce Maya in a second. And she's a member of MCU and has extensive experience in the working class movement. And we're really lucky to have her here joining us to talk about that, as well as broadly the history of International Working Women's Day. But before we go any further, I just want to emphasize the importance of taking this question seriously, which I'm sure, for all viewers on this channel, there's some agreement about, but sometimes there's agreement and then we can deepen that agreement and deepen that understanding through a little reference to history and some of the lessons from it. So viewers may know Joan Hinton, who spent, was an American who then moved to revolutionary China and spent an extensive amount of time there. And towards the end of her life, she was talking about the experiences of women in China and the Chinese Revolution and Cultural Revolution. And she said, quote, "Personally, I found that an extremely sensitive test of line was and is the attitude towards women. In China, capitalist rotors were invariably male chauvinists." And this is just important for us to remember, not just for a future socialist society, but even today under capitalist societies or in semi-feudal, semi-colonial countries, that invariably, when someone has a bad attitude towards women, a male chauvinist attitude towards women, it's generally not an isolated thing. It's indicative of deeper political problems. So hopefully that lesson, we can carry that forward both in this live stream tomorrow, International Working Women's Day, and beyond. So Maya, do you want to introduce yourself, give us a little background on who you are, why you're joining us today, and so on?
Yes, I do. Happy early International Working Women's Day. I'm so excited to be here. Also, to the point that you're making, Ryan, the revisionists would also say, we need to support the women's movement. We need to support the liberation of women. But that also is something we're going to, in practice, put off until a later date. So that aligns well with the quote that you shared. I want to share a few stories, I guess, that also will give you a sense of my character, I think. So before this live stream started, just an hour ago, I went to go pull my desk over to this side of the wall so you could get some view of my art in the background. And as I did that, the leg to my desk broke. I was like, oh crap. So then I flipped over the desk, I went to repair it, and then the other leg broke. And my desk is basically made of cardboard. And this relates to just the fact that with the drive among capitalists for greater and greater profits through higher turnover of capital, they are making less quality goods, like goods that just have pretty terrible quality to them. And that's a good representation of the desk that I have. It doesn't mean that you need to have a shitty desk to be a proletarian, but I do in fact have a very crappy desk. The other thing I wanted,
I like it. Just to say, we're 2 minutes into stream, and already you've brought up the contradiction between value and use value. It's fantastic.
Yes, that is the contradiction I was talking about in layman's terms. Okay, second thing, I wanted to just make a comment about the graphic that was made for this live stream. It was beautifully done. It's just gorgeous, the colors, the layout, etc. But also, one could get the impression that I think that I am the highest synthesis of proletarian feminism because my head is bigger than Zetkin's and Gandhi's. I do not think that. I am really a shrimp relative to them in terms of their contributions to the communist movement at large. But I am inspired by them, and we as MCU are inspired by them. And we do aspire to contribute on a high theoretical plane to proletarian feminism and advancing an understanding of that among American communists and in the international communist movement. So that's another point. The third point I wanted to make, so sorry, this is the massive preface.
No, don't be sorry. This is great. The viewers get a sense of your character, like you said, who you are, and how you evaluate yourself. It's fantastic.
Thanks, Ryan. I also shouldn't apologize. Women, you should just not apologize for elaborating politically and sharply. I'm wearing this shirt here. It's from a local in Kentucky. It's actually the shirt I'm wearing in the photo that was used for the graphic for this live stream. Coincidentally, this shirt has, hold on, big reveal. It has a bunch of women on the back, and it says like woman solidarity. There's a positive and there's a negative aspect to the shirt, okay? I'll start with the negative aspect, which is that it's basically Rosie the Riveter, but just multicultural. All shades of brown, Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter, for those who don't know, was the woman who was used as like the image of bourgeois propaganda to rally women into the industry during World War II. And so we have to oppose that aspect of this shirt. But it is not common for there to be union shirts that have women on the back and celebrate women's solidarity. So that is a positive aspect of it. It's why I wear it today. Okay, done with the preface.
Wait, one last thing. I'm sorry, you mentioned Rosie the Riveter. So we got to say that itself is contradictory, right? Because the mass influx of women into the workplace, even though it was done to aid the U.S. imperialist machinations during World War II, and there's a positive and negative aspect opposing fascism versus, solidifying the U.S. as top dog imperialist power, but that was such a threat to the ruling class, the mass mobilization of women into the workplace, that they had to bring out in the 1950s the reaction of McCarthyism and 1950s housewife stuff to really try to say, woman, your place is in the house. So even though it was overall this negative push for U.S. imperialism, there were some positive aspects to it. Women's consciousness really got raised. And it's not a coincidence that basically a generation after that, you have the second wave feminist movement and a lot of young women saying, this is bullshit. We don't want to be confined to the household. Our place is in the struggle.
Very well said. And honestly, I was going to just skim over a more dialectical understanding of Rosie the Riveter, but you said it very well. And I think also we'll get into this in the live stream, but with that mass influx of women into industrial production was also the organization of those women, which the communists led, and then more militant struggles and a real revival or like a true expression of women's liberation in the working class movement at the time. So there's a lot to say there that's very positive as well. You're right, Ryan. Okay, I'm Maya. I'm an MCU. I'm a very proud member of MCU. And yeah, so I worked in UPS and in Amazon. So because I worked at UPS, I was in the Teamsters, for those who may not know. And being a part of that union, I was a steward, and I also was an Amazon organizer. So that's how I got into Amazon organizing. And I organized there for about a year. We didn't actually go forward with an election campaign at my building, but we tried to. And there's a lot of reasons why that couldn't work, why that failed. It speaks to a lot of the problems that exist at large right now with organizing Amazon. We won't go into the particulars there. Maybe that's another live stream. I don't know. But yeah, that's me. That's a little bit of my experience in the working class movement. That's what I'll be speaking on.
Yeah, well, that's an extremely modest summary of yourself and your contributions and your efforts. But I think people can already probably get a sense of your downplaying of your sharpness, given the earlier comments you made before talking about yourself. But people will see more of that as we continue with this live stream. Okay, so let's talk about the format for today. So just for the audience, basically what we're going to do is Maya and I will present a little bit on the history of the International Working Women's Day, a little bit on, well, Maya will talk about that. I'll talk a little bit about the origin of patriarchy. These will be brief. We're not going to have visual aids for them. So we just want to give people a little bit of context to frame everything we're going to say about the contemporary situation for women in the working class movement, specifically in the US. And then Maya will talk briefly about the ways in particular that patriarchy functions under capitalism. And then we'll get into the nitty gritty of the working class movement and women's place in the struggle today, and some examples from Maya's experience, as well as some of my own in the working class movement. So that's our rough trajectory. We'll start with a little bit of theory, background, a little more abstract, then we'll get into the concrete. And by starting at the abstract, we'll be able to really understand the concrete examples a lot better, because without that broader level theoretical abstraction, it can be easy to fall into empiricist tendencies. Okay, so Maya, you want to take us away on a little background of the history of International Working Women's Day?
Yes, I do. Great overview, Ryan. So yes, I'm going to do a brief history as much as I can. And I don't want people to feel like they have to memorize every single thing I'm going to say. The key point that I want people to take away, the most important point for people to understand, is that International Working Women's Day originated with the communist movement. Without the communist movement, there would be no International Working Women's Day. It's possible that the bourgeoisie could have tossed us a crumb at some point to say, okay, here's a Women's Day. But this wouldn't have had a proletarian nor an international character to it. So it wouldn't have the rich history that it actually does have behind it. So we have to understand this history in order to properly celebrate it. Let's start off with 1909. The American socialists established a Women's Day as a part of their fight for women's suffrage. Clara Zetkin then sees this, and her and Rosa Luxemburg are inspired by the American socialists. So then in 1910, they proposed to the Second International that an official International Working Women's Day is established. And Zetkin was very clear on why this made sense to do, why it was necessary for socialist parties internationally to rally around a Working Women's Day. It was because the vote in the hands of women alone, while under capitalism, could not release her from her shackles. This much she knew, this much socialists knew. The fight for women's suffrage was necessary, but the fight could not end there. And the political forces that would be necessary and the most capable of leading the charge beyond the women's vote to actually women's liberation, and that being in line with the fight for the emancipation of humanity as a whole, needed to be those socialists. So they needed basically this day to both campaign for the vote, but then also just to campaign generally for women's emancipation, and that being linked with the fight for communism. So the day that ends up being chosen, that's March 19th, which is the same day that the German working class movement was able to force the Prussian king to concede women the right to vote. That was the reasoning for that day. So from then on until 1915, we see these righteous struggles being waged on this day, on March 19th, in the name of emancipating women and the working class as a whole. I'll give you one example. In 1911, on International Working Women's Day, more than 1 million people across all of Europe rallied to hoist the banner high of women's emancipation through a proletarian revolution, which is just incredible. Then in 1915 and 16, we see the capitulation of a great number of socialists from the Second International, who end up supporting their domestic ruling classes in waging World War I. This capitulation and those opportunists end up blocking major efforts on the part of women to come out and oppose the war. So basically what we see is this momentary weakening of the communist movement, which reciprocally then weakens the women's movement, but not for long. On March 8th, 1917, as many of you know, women textile workers in Russia took to a very militant strike and protests against the war. Just to give you a sense of how militant this was, in a sheer number of days, the strike increased to 200,000 workers. And it was of such a magnitude that it was able to bring over tens of thousands of the Tsar's soldiers to join the strikers, which is just incredible. This massive strike ends up sparking the February Revolution, which is what caused the Tsar to abdicate. And that would then be the precursor to the Bolshevik Revolution, or the October Revolution. Then, as just a final point, 1921, the Third Congress of the Comintern adopts March 8th as International Working Women's Day, that same day that the women textile workers went on strike. And it was based on their heroic role that they did this. A few countries before this point were celebrating March 8th as International Working Women's Day, but it really wasn't until this point, after the Comintern established it as the internationally recognized International Working Women's Day, that this was celebrated globally, recognized globally, etc. In sum, you can see just the rich communist history here behind this day. And the bourgeoisie, as Ryan said in the beginning, has routinely tried to obfuscate this history and co-opt it for themselves as well. So in order to combat that, we have to honor the history, understand the history, but also carry forward the mantle of proletarian feminism. And that's really the most important aspect of that dialectic there. So that's the end of that.
Well, thanks for that great and vibrant overview. Just to build off the last point about the Comintern really spreading this. It's the next year in 1922 that in a number of countries around the world, including in China, that International Working Women's Day is celebrated for the first time. And this was very important because it established a strong women's movement in China that was inextricably tied to the communist movement. Now, of course, there was already women's struggles for emancipation, but it really put the Marxist perspective on the women's movement in the forefront of that movement, as opposed to bourgeois feminism, which obviously in a semi-feudal country would still have a progressive character, even a revolutionary character, but which would have really hamstrung the struggle for women's emancipation. And by way of contrast, we can see, the Comintern spread International Working Women's Day all over. And so China, India, a bunch of other countries, colonies and semi-colonies, this was spread to. But in a place like China, where the communists were in the leading force in the women's movement, we can contrast that with a place like India, where the Communist Party there, because of its shortcomings and political failures, never could really fully take that role. And we can see the different trajectory for women in China and India because of that. So in China, obviously with capitalist restoration, women face a difficult situation today, but the Chinese Revolution eliminated the overwhelming majority of the feudal oppression of women, foot binding, dowry, all that sort of stuff. In contrast, in India today, the women there are still subject to caste-based oppression and gender violence, are still subject to practices like sati, this form of bride burning. All these feudal practices are still there because, even when the bourgeois feminists came in and fought for the women's movement, they were quite weak fighters overall. And they really were largely concerned with the emancipation of their class, and not even fully their class, right? Because they compromised and it's a semi-colony in India today, and not with women more broadly. So these two trajectories show the difference, actually, of when the women's movement is led by communist forces versus when communist forces fail to lead it. And that's a very important historical lesson, and an important point of contrast that we can emphasize as Marxists to people who might be interested in Marxist views on feminism but might not quite understand it, who have heard some anti-communist narratives that, Marxists don't really care about patriarchy, and it was just like academics in the US and Europe in the 1970s who first started caring about patriarchy, or all that garbage. Okay. With all that being said, I'm going to talk briefly about the origin of patriarchy. Because just as we look forward towards socialism and communism as the key way to overcome patriarchy, so we also have to look backwards in order to understand the rise of patriarchy. Because patriarchy is not an essential feature of human society. In contrast, it is a particular historical phenomenon which arose given a certain set of social circumstances. It came into being, and it will pass out of being. It will be overcome, not automatically, but through struggle. So just to make this point a little more concrete, depending on where you draw the line, and there's some debate, human beings have existed for between 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 years, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. It's a question of demarcation. And I'm not going to get into the debate on that right now. Patriarchy has been around for a few thousand years. So really less than 10% of human history as a real institution. And so obviously thousands of years is a lot of time. The patriarchal ideas, they weigh heavily on the present. It's an extremely developed form of oppression. But as Marxists, we need to think historically and therefore understand that this phenomena is not eternal. And especially in the present moment where there's all this nihilism, hopelessness, and defeatism, it's important to see that historical perspective and therefore understand that this can be overcome. So Engels outlines the basic contours of how patriarchy developed in a text, The Origins of Family, Private Property, and the State, which is a fantastic text, and really gets at, even with the scant historical information about some of the early class societies that Engels had available to him, how patriarchy and the family form and private property in the state arose. And actually, subsequent historical discoveries that Engels didn't know about these early class societies have only confirmed further the basic contours of Marxist understanding of the rise of patriarchy. So early on, human society was not a class society. It was, as Marx and Engels called it, primitive communism. It was a tribal society organized matrilineally, and there was generally group marriages early on. In a situation of group marriage, it's generally not possible to determine who the father is, but it's obvious who the mother is of the child. And so property was owned communally, society was organized based on matrilineal kinship structures, and inheritance happened communally through the matrilineal line, or the matriarchal line. Now, just to be clear, matrilineal society does not mean matriarchal society. That does not mean that men were oppressed in this period. They weren't. Men and women were very equal. Marriages were freely entered into and freely dissolved. There was equality in the kinship structure and in the society between men and women. Obviously, we don't want to go back to primitive communist society. The level of production was very low. Scientific understanding was very, very low, and so on. But there's a lot of positives there that Engels talks about in Origins, and how free people were in comparison to class society and so-called democracy, bourgeois democracy, as we know. Now, I can't get into all of the details of how things changed and developed, how patriarchy arose, and how class society developed. It's just not possible in a live stream. Origins is a dense text. There's other stuff that's important to read too. But basically, what happened is, with the development of production and the possibility of, and there's more factors than this, but this is one of the major ones, the possibility of enslaving other human beings and forcing them to work for the benefit of the people who enslaved them, human societies began to change, and sub-tribes began to conquer and capture and enslave others. The first slaves, as far as we can tell, were women, potentially slaves like marriage slaves, effectively. And there was a big struggle around the same time period over if inheritance should be matrilineal or patrilineal. And with the rise of the pairing marriage and monogamous marriages, it was possible to tell who the father was. And then there was a struggle over, should the men's child, should like the son inherit the property, or should the matrilineal clan? And there's a lot of details to this struggle. I won't get into it, but effectively, in many societies, the matrilineal form of society was overthrown. Slavery was established. Women began to be oppressed. Early temple towns were founded. The systematic institution of prostitution through those temples was really one of the first systematic forms of patriarchy. And Engels, speaking of this time, says, the woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of man's lust and a mere instrument for the production of children, which is a huge change from being venerated as the matrilineal leader of the society. And around the same time, one of the driving factors of this is the accumulation of private property, which then intensifies, obviously, with the overthrow of matrilineal society and the breakdown of collective ownership. This leads to the intensification of the early forms of class differentiation in these societies, where really social classes and a gap between rich and poor, and then obviously free people and slaves, become established and cemented, not as mere aberrations, but as institutions. And then the state is needed to preserve the class society and defend the class antagonisms and preserve the position of the rising ruling class. And what we see here in this early period is the removal of women from social production, her restriction to the household, and the systematic degradation of the status of women in society, which happens in a lot of complex ways. I mean, the economic transformation of women's role has impacted the superstructural level and the cultural level. And you can even see this reflected in the status of female gods, beginning to first be degraded and then disappear over time in mythology. And Gerda Lerner, who was one time a communist and wrote a pretty good book called The Creation of Patriarchy, talks about this and how this happened in the early Mesopotamian city-states with the rise of patriarchy. And with this establishment of class society, women's status is fundamentally degraded, but it's not then the same through each class society. In slave societies, the oppression of women is somewhat different than feudalism, which is different than in capitalism. Of course, women are oppressed in all these societies, but as class society develops and class antagonisms heighten and transform, the status of women and their oppression changes. We won't get into all that today, but it's important to note that patriarchy functions in different insidious ways in these different class societies. And on the one hand, we can see with the development of class society, the intensification of the oppression of women. That is, there's new horrors on a mass scale meted out against women by the ruling class and their agents under capitalism. They just weren't possible, even though there was many atrocities in past societies. They weren't possible under slavery or under feudalism. It's just a huge scale at which capitalists carry out things like genocide and so on. On the other hand, the development of class society and the sharpening of class antagonisms also provides the basis for the overcoming of patriarchy and patriarchal oppression. And in particular, women are now involved in socialized production on a huge scale, even though they're, of course, still required to do domestic labor and are therefore doubly oppressed. And this means that the social condition of women, while facing new horrors, these social conditions also are now more favorable for them on a mass scale to develop clarity on the ultimate source of their oppression and to fight together in class solidarity with other proletarian fighters and other progressive classes to overcome it. And working class women in particular have a distinct interest in this struggle to overcome patriarchy and class society, as opposed to, say, petty bourgeois women who, when they take up the fight against patriarchy, they're generally limited by the perspective of fighting for formal equality before the law or other forms of equality before the law, as opposed to the complete abolition of class distinctions generally. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not saying someone from a petty bourgeois class background can't take on a proletarian class stand. That's entirely possible. But we see petty bourgeois feminism time and time again fight for equality within the bourgeois system. And even if they say they're against capitalism, not really understand how to fundamentally uproot patriarchy. And so to explain that, I just want to quote from Origins and then talk briefly about socialist China before moving on from this section. So in Origins of the Family, Private Property of the State, Engels says, quote, to emancipate woman and make her the equal of man is and remains an impossibility so long as the woman is shut out from social productive labor. The emancipation of women will only be possible when women can take part in production on a large social scale, and domestic work no longer claims anything but an insignificant part of her time. Now, Engels is not saying this is the comprehensive solution to patriarchy. The struggle against patriarchy takes many forms, including the struggle against the oppressive ideas in the backs of people's mind, including the struggle against all sorts of things like sexual violence, discrimination, etc. But his point is you have to have a situation, which is only possible under socialism, where women, their economic status is one of equality to men, and not just formal equality, where they're free to participate in social labor, but where they no longer have the dual burden of working, as they do under capitalism, in social production, and then also having to do all the housework. And so to break from this formal equality before the law, but inequality in reality, which is, as they spoke of it during the Cultural Revolution, a form of bourgeois right, where equality masks real inequality, formal equality masks real inequality, it's necessary to have things like collective childcare under socialism to ensure that women are actually able to attend political meetings, participate in political struggles, and not forced to, after working, just go back home and take care of the kids and clean up and so on. And there's a lot more to be said about this whole process of the emancipation of women. There's a lot of struggles that have to happen under socialism against different ideas and social relations. And we're not going to get into all that today. But hopefully this gives at least a sense of how patriarchy developed and the way forward for the struggle against it under socialism. And now Maya's going to take us away talking a little bit about how patriarchy exists under capitalism, as we don't want to jump right ahead to socialism before we understand what's going on in our current situation.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that, Ryan. That was really well said. And you got at the progressive aspect well of women being brought into production. Now they can participate in the overthrow of the ruling class. This is great. But of course, we also, as you were getting at too, need to get at the horrors of patriarchy under capitalism and really how capitalism continues to perpetuate patriarchy and how the ruling class benefits from this. So in order to do this, I'm going to give you a general overview of patriarchy and how it's propped up under capitalism. To do that, I'm going to show you how that happens through the economic base and then also the superstructure. So let's go over the terms really quick. The economic base in society is, more simply put, capitalist production, and the superstructure can be understood to be the other social phenomenon propped up by capitalist production. So the culture, institutions, religion, media, the state. So not just social phenomena, of course, we also have political institutions. But we can understand those two things to be those on a basic level. And as Ryan said at the way beginning of this live stream, I want to give you an understanding of how patriarchy is propped up by capitalism so that we can apply the general to the particular when we start to have our discussion after I stop talking. So to start, when it comes to the relationship between patriarchy and the economic base, there's a few ways that this plays out. For one, since the early stages of capitalism, and even still today, capitalists have benefited from paying women a lower wage on average relative to men. We'll get into that a little bit more in the particulars later. For two, capitalism has also benefited from maintaining a gender social division of labor. Through this, capitalists have also been able to justify paying women less. I have a particular example that pertains to this as well, that played out on the shop floor. And I'll get a little bit into like what I mean by the social division of labor and how this ends up dividing up genders in society. For three, capitalists benefit from keeping domestic labor a private affair. Basically, this way, working women have to reproduce themselves and their husbands or wives as well, if they're married, using their wages and then labor to, in effect, subsidize the capitalists. Free childcare services, no need to put the surplus that capitalists hold in society to this when women can take up the labor on their own, raise the next generation of wage slaves, and apply their wages to do so. What a wonderful society we live in. So for four, housewives, I think these women are often looked at as being kind of unaffected by capitalism, but it just couldn't be further from the truth. These housewives from poor backgrounds that have the potential to be sucked into, working class jobs often are when capital commands. So for example, during wartime production, as we were talking about earlier. In this sense, housewives are part of the reserve army of labor. Those people that are kind of the surplus that aren't necessarily working class jobs in that immediate moment, but have the potential to be when capital demands. The fifth point I have is that women are commodified through the sex industry, which rakes in millions of profits. So trafficking of women from the neo-colonies, objectification through the industry. It's also a problem for women domestically, of course. Those are 5 points that get at how patriarchy is propped up by the economic base. Now I'll turn to the superstructure and the ideology of patriarchy that basically just penetrates all areas of the superstructure. But it's important to note also that patriarchy in the superstructure derives its strength from the economic base. So to go into a few aspects, which is not totally comprehensive. For one, education. Gender discrimination in education leads to all sorts of discrepancies in men versus women. So there's lots of things to get at here, like how coming to rational knowledge, hard sciences, etc., is greater promoted among men versus women. Higher education is often seen as like a means to marriage for many women. It's encouraged for them to see it that way. Many women globally are still deprived of education. For two, media. Women just portrayed as a sex object often, told to hollow themselves out for male attention. This is done by makeup ads. We're encouraged to wear restrictive clothing or overly sexual clothing. This promotes eating disorders. I know women out there understand this very well. And men alike too. For three, religion, which basically just as a whole sanctifies the role of the patriarch and woman's submission to man. For four, religion, there are laws that grant women freedoms as much as freedom can exist in a bourgeois society. Those have been won through militant struggles, of course, waged by the women's movement. But law also just acts as this very convenient mask for the continued oppression of women. And you can see this play out on the international scale when it comes to victims of domestic violence, legalizing the sex industry, and so on. So there's no need to memorize those points that I said. Please don't. I think the major point, or one of the major points to get at here, is that patriarchy isn't just this social phenomenon divorced of its roots in production that is based in classes. In other words, patriarchy, as I was saying before, derives its primary power from class-based production. And it's through that then patriarchy is reinforced socially. This point is very important to understand, because too often feminists, and I really mean like petty bourgeois radical liberals, will think that the struggle against patriarchy is just a cultural one. And I just want people who maybe like lean towards that to think about this. How can we change the hypersexualization of women when the sex industry still exists? How can we change the view that women should primarily be doing the housework when household labor is a private affair? How is it possible, the broader question really, for women to be culturally equal, socially equal, if some section of women are still shackled by wage slavery? These are just the most crucial questions to be asking ourselves. They're very basic, but from that, and if we use Marxism, we can understand how it doesn't make sense to just say that patriarchy solely exists in the social sphere of things. It does exist in the social sphere, but it's reinforced through the economic base. So in sum, feminism will not actually lead to the liberation of women when it's divorced from an understanding of the need to fight for the liberation of the working class. The liberation of women and the liberation of the working class are dialectically related. And that is the major message of our live stream today, I think. So that's all I got.
Yeah, that's extremely well said. And it's a concerning trend when people just focus on the social elements. And there's people who do it just simply out of ignorance, but there's a conscious effort by the ruling class to obfuscate the class-based oppression that happens, and therefore the intrinsic link between that and the oppression of women. Without that perspective, or if it's reduced just to equal pay, fights for equal pay with men, it's impossible to actually make almost any progress in the fight for the emancipation of women. And what progress is made will be confined to the upper class women, both the bourgeois women and the petty bourgeois women, generally the upper stratum of them, college educated, middle class office professionals, etc. And that leaves behind and really advances that struggle at the expense of working class women and other oppressed classes. And it's just disgusting, honestly, to see. And people can use all sorts of things to mask it, like identity politics or other things, but without a fundamentally proletarian feminist perspective, it's impossible to truly fight for the liberation of women. Now, I just want to build off what you said a little bit before we get into the next section on the working class movement today. One thing I think that's important to see is obviously capitalist society throws men and women in competition with each other for jobs, especially amongst the working class. But this is also reflected on the ideological plane, especially where the family form, the bourgeois family form, is the cellular structure or the cellular aspect of cellular form, whatever, cellular structure of capitalist society. It's how private property is passed down. I want to just qualify this by saying that often amongst oppressed groups, the family form is also a site of resistance. For example, in the US, under slavery, slaves weren't allowed to form families, so the family became a site of real equality often and intense resistance. That said, under capitalism is this thing of the family form being a site of often intense abuse, but also the reproduction of capitalist society and the inheritance of private property. So people are competing for jobs. They're competing in a certain sense for romantic partners. And people shouldn't be seeing romantic partners in that way, but people do literally compete with each other for them. Competing for male attention or female attention, competing with each other in sports, like this competition between men and women, but also male-male competition and female-female competition. That is a reflection of patriarchy, and a very intense one, where people are taught to fight each other and like people who they really need to be uniting with in the struggle, whether it be the struggle against a particular patriarchal oppressor, or the struggle against a particular company, or the struggle against the capitalist society as the whole. And without this perspective of overcoming the competition amongst the people and promoting real class-conscious solidarity and proletarian feminist solidarity, it is incredibly hard to actually weld people together into a revolutionary force. So, okay, with all that being said, there's a lot more to talk about. We'll get into some specific examples of this. But I want to shift the focus a bit. And Maya and I are now going to talk a little bit about the situation for proletarian women in the working class movement in the US today. Because people often have some sense of, okay, the oppression of women. We're familiar with some of the horrible rape culture in the country and all the other bullshit, at least people hopefully are, that women face, but often what's not talked about nearly enough in feminist circles, and honestly in a lot of Marxist circles, is the actual conditions for proletarian women in the working class movement, both the oppression they face, but also their resistance to that oppression and their role in the fight against capital. So we're going to get into a bit of that now.
Absolutely. And just to say, the point that you're making about competition between intragender competition is so important, because to combat that is what it means to actually exude solidarity, class solidarity and solidarity among women. For example, like female competition is very common in society, and very disgusting. What's also common is for women to understand, as women do, their oppression in society, and then to go to other women and just use each other as dumping grounds for complaining about, my husband sucks, you know, my boyfriend sucks, he doesn't listen, he doesn't care, he doesn't do the work in the house, whatever. Very reasonable things to be frustrated at. But then what happens? A lot of the time, women will just go back to those men. And that's because of the reinforced ideas in society of patriarchy, of course. But like, let's look at the problem here. What is necessary to actually overcome those patriarchal relationships? What is necessary to actually overcome patriarchy in society? What is actually necessary for having solidarity, real solidarity with women? It's not to just say, yeah, just put up with that shit, girl. Yeah, like, I feel you. I do the same in my relationship. I also, you know, whatever. It's not that. We have to arm ourselves with an understanding of, why does patriarchal ideology exist in society? What is upholding patriarchal ideology in society? How do we actually combat that? And it takes Marxism to do that. It just does. It takes Marxism to be able to develop that understanding, and then to exude true solidarity with other women, and class solidarity as being a massive underpinning of that solidarity, that gender solidarity. So that's, I guess, me getting on my soapbox a bit, but
no, that's what you're here for, to talk about things just like that. So that was fantastic, and a really important lesson, and not only a lesson for people to internalize themselves, but to spread to others. Because, you know, as we know, there's a lot of very patriarchal relationships out there, and people are, you know, in a sense, most vulnerable in their relationships, and that can be a really good thing in a positive and loving relationship, in a proletarian relationship, and it can be a really bad thing in a toxic and patriarchal and abusive relationship. So it's a great point, and really a lesson that people, men and women, need to take up.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. Okay, on to the direction you proposed here. Yes, oppression from capital on the shop floor. There's a lot of things to say. I want to give an example that relates to what I was talking about earlier about the gender social division of labor. So basically what I'm talking about here is patriarchal prejudice applied to women that then determines what role she's going to be playing in production. The prejudice itself is influenced by a few different ideas, but I think the most common thing is just to say that women are weaker and less capable intellectually, or more simply put, stupid. So, of course, there are relevant biological differences on average when it comes to physical strength between men and women, but women can be just as strong, at times stronger than men, than some section of men, and just as capable intellectually as well. Yet because of patriarchal prejudice, we see women funneled into the light and easy jobs. So on the scale of society, we see this playing out where women will basically be playing a role that is practically an extension of her domestic work, being a domestic servant, being a nurse, being a teacher, a clerk, a salesgirl. So that's what's happening on the scale of society, and women being funneled into specific industries according to that extension of her domestic work. Then there is the case where women on just a single shop floor can be funneled into specific roles according to her gender. And this was true at Amazon. So I want to just talk about that in particular. Women, as I was getting at earlier, were put on the jobs that are seen as like more nimble and non-heavy lifting tasks. So in the warehouse, that meant that women would be sorting envelopes over heavy boxes, or pushing boxes versus throwing boxes onto belts, and other such tasks. Some people I found on the shop floor have looked at this division of labor and thought that this is either a neutral or even a net positive thing, because women are on average not doing the big, heavy, dangerous lifting. So in effect, they are saved. And this just couldn't be further from the truth when it comes to those women that are funneled into those roles of nimble, non-heavy lifting tasks. And I'll give two examples, or make 2 points that kind of demonstrate this, both when it comes to the dangers of the job and then the economic factor. So First of all, of course, doing lighter tasks by no means implies safer. It by no means implies that. They are not one-to-one related. So when it came to my Amazon shop floor, and I think this is the case across a lot of warehouses, women on average would be told to do inducting, it's called, which is basically to use like this handheld stamp machine to put stickers onto envelopes and boxes. And women on average would do that. They're also encouraged to go at a incredibly fast rate. So this type of work would often give people carpal tunnel. And I know a woman who was in Amazon for, I think, a year and a half, and about at the half-year mark, she was doing inducting almost every single day, working full-time. And she developed carpal tunnel in a year, in solely a year, which speaks to the rate at which people are being forced to work. But then also, because women on average are being forced to do inducting more than men, we're seeing this problem of carpal tunnel more pronounced in the woman population at Amazon. Now, I'm not going off of official Amazon statistics because they would never put the empirical data out here to allow us to come to this rational knowledge. This is just based off of my own experience and talking to others nationally.
I just want to say, oh, sorry. I'm reminded of the beginning of Modern Times with Charlie Chaplin, where he's just like turning the screws over and over and over again. And that becomes literally, he can't do anything but that. He's reduced to it. And it's tied to the point that Marx makes that under in large scale industry, the worker becomes reduced to an appendage of the machine. But what you're getting at here very concretely is the gendered division of labor in the way workers become an appendage of the machine. And therefore the differential actually damage and oppression that women face, damage done to women's health and oppression they face because of this gender division of labor. So it's very nuanced. There's more to say, but I want you to keep going. I just wanted to jump in on that point.
Exactly. And like, okay, to your point, all workers are being treated as these appendages. The men that are having to do the heavy lifting with those heavy boxes, yeah, they're breaking their backs. Like, it's pretty terrible. But there is a particular problem that is playing out with women that is due to her oppression, that is due to the gendered social division of labor, as we were talking about. So absolutely, it's a great point to make. Okay, the second point, the economic factor. Because women are relegated to lighter work and barred from different training as well. That's a whole other dimension to the division of labor. Because women are seen as more stupid, less intellectually capable, etc. Because of both of those factors, they're often not given overtime shifts, the same number of them or at the same rate as men. So there's a couple points to make here. The first one I want to make is that this discrimination in terms of getting overnight or overtime shifts, they are overnight as well. This is playing out with automation and the subjective decisions on the part of management. So with automation, Amazon, and I think this is something that kind of broadly exists for companies. They like to front that, oh, automation is just this neutral thing. There's no discrimination that plays out with automation. That's my capitalist voice, I guess. So Amazon likes to front that all overtime shifts are given to workers with the same likelihood, but that's just not the case. Shifts will be sent out to different categories of people according to the area in which they're trained or their skills. So as I got at, if women are not being trained in as diverse of areas, then it just flows from that they're not going to get as many overtime shifts. And that is true in my immediate experience. That's what I've seen and I've experienced myself. The other thing that has played out is on this like level of the management's decisions, like the subjective calculation that plays out. And that subjective calculation that plays out is in part due to this thing of skills that I'm talking about, but it's also just due to this, like the patriarchal ideas that management have, where they say, they kind of size people up and they say, oh, you're kind of big, you're strong, you're a man. We're going to give you this overtime shift because we need people that can work fast and are strong in order to be able to, push out those boxes just a little bit quicker. This is obviously just like pretty terrible for the men as well that are in that position. But there is something to be said about how this affects women, because this is the economic factor here. The differences in shift opportunities does create a real financial difference. The wage at Amazon is already just about at the floor in terms of what is needed for workers to reproduce themselves, as in to eat, sleep, pay for bills, and then come to work the next day. And this is why so many workers end up looking for extra shifts. this is why the ultimate thing, or not the ultimate thing, because ultimate thing is a revolution, but something that needs to be done in Amazon is that there needs to be a union. There needs to be a fight for a better wage. So workers don't have to be working 50, 60 hours a week in order to just make enough to reproduce themselves. But the point is that where women can't get these overtime shifts due to patriarchy, due to the gender social division of labor, they are restricted in their ability to reproduce themselves sufficiently. So here we can see the link between patriarchal oppression and economic oppression. So just as like a final point here, and then I'll hand it back to you, Ryan. The gender-based social division of labor manifests in different ways in different spheres of production, as in different industries. And then manifests in different ways on different shop floors, in different companies in those industries, before even talking about different shop floors. But behind this arbitrary application of a gender-based social division of labor is the overarching systematic problem of patriarchal oppression, which is reinforced by capitalist production and then also in the culture as well. That's all I got.
Oh, that was amazing. There's a few things to say in response. First, I'm reminded of what Lenin said, that the living soul of Marxism is concrete analysis of concrete situations. And the perspective you're bringing here really gets at, like, in order to fight against patriarchy, we can't just say we're against patriarchy. You know, that's a great stand to take, and it's an important stand to take, but it's a first step. And there's a lot of groups on the left, even some Marxist groups, that like points of unity. We're against capitalism. One sentence on capitalism. We're against patriarchy. One sentence on patriarchy. And generally people have a little bit more of a developed analysis. But if we want to practice actually a proletarian feminism, like a feminism that actually captures the and inspires, captures the attention and inspires working class women to take up the fight, we have to really know the concrete. Marxists have to know the concrete. If you don't, and you're just going in and sloganeering about patriarchy, even if you see a few things, like some oppression, the more blatant, obvious oppression for managers and sexist harassment and so on, that's not enough. And to tie this to a second point, if comrades have read Lenin's early agitational pamphlets to the Thornton factory workers and others, it's very important actually for Marxists, especially at the early stage of trying to link up to the working class, to read those and to understand how detailed Lenin's knowledge was of the conditions of the workers and the different ways in which they were pitted against each other and the ways to overcome that division. And what you've done here, and I know you're already uncomfortable with the graphic, but I'm going to say is a real carrying out of that spirit that Lenin basically exemplifies in his writing and tells Marxists over and over again to take up, which is to understand the concrete and to tie it back to the general, to the theoretical level of understanding of patriarchy and how it functions on a broad social level. But if we don't understand the concrete dynamics, and if we can't explain in clear terms to the workers the particular instances of oppression that they face and how those are tied to the more general social problems, it's impossible to win them over for the struggle for a union, let alone the struggle for the overthrow of the ruling class. And sometimes workers will spontaneously take up a union struggle, but if you really want to make that a fighting struggle where you can raise class consciousness beyond a basic trade unionism, it's not going to be possible without this sort of analysis.
Yeah, that's really well said, Ryan. I'm reminded of just this point, a very simple point, that to not apply Marxism in a living fashion is breeding grounds for opportunism. And we can look specifically at the case of women's liberation, right? To not apply Marxism to the concrete conditions that women are facing, working women in particular, is and absolutely necessary. It leads to this line that, yeah, women's liberation is important, but we should put it off till later, which is in effect to not actually struggle for women's liberation and to not see the dialectical relation between women's liberation and the emancipation of the working class. So yes, we do have to apply Marxism to concrete conditions. We have to use it to understand what are the actual conditions, what is the situation that working women are facing in order to provide direction to that. That's the whole point of being a communist. You know, we're not just here to talk about our book knowledge. We're not just here to talk about theory. We're here to put that into practice, as Mao says. And in order to do that, we have to go among the working class. We have to understand their conditions, and we have to be a part of their struggles. That doesn't mean we go and wage union campaigns. I don't think that's the most advantageous for communists right now.
Well, for communists in the US, you mean? Sorry,
yeah, that's a good point. For communists in the US specifically right now. But, you know, we do have to understand the different shifts that are happening in the working class movement. We have to provide ideological intervention, and we do have to link up in the struggles of the working class. And it's only through doing that that we will be able to establish a party, to make a revolution happen. So yeah, your point is just so key. And yeah, it's no wonder that those that can't apply Marxism in a living fashion do go down the dogmatic route. And they do end up being revisionists. And they don't make a party. They don't make revolution happen. Things are more complicated than that. There's a lot of barriers to making a revolution happen. But as communists, like, this is our main task here. This is like a key principle for what it means to be a communist, to actually take Marxism and apply it in a living fashion.
Yeah, that's very well said. And hopefully all of this analysis gives people a sense of how in MCU we've been able to, you know, really sum up some of the lessons and experiences we've had in the working class movement and really bring, well, both to others, but to light more broadly, a analysis of the conditions for working class people and working class women specifically, even in the limited amount of experience we've had in the working class movement. And we certainly have a lot to learn, but it gives a sense. Now, to shift gears just a little bit, and there's a lot more to say about what you've already talked about here, but we're going to shift focus a bit now to the role that women play in the working class movement, in the struggle specifically, not just the oppression they face in the patriarchal oppression the capitalists met out and the logic of capital mets out, not just individual capitalists or managers, but how women fight back. And we'll talk about some of your experiences at Amazon, UPS, and some of mine in the working class movement as well. So you want to get us started on this topic, Maya?
Absolutely. The key thing I want to focus on is workplace harassment. Though there were a lot of struggles that I faced, that we faced, in being able to galvanize men and women alike in actually opposing workplace harassment. So I want to start off by just saying, like, there were a number of women that played very key roles in struggles on the shop floor that I participated in at UPS and Amazon alike. And these women, like, I just can't even exactly, if I struggled to, I could, but it's hard to put into words how much they inspired me. The outspokenness, how bold they were, the willingness to take a stand repeatedly, not just for themselves, but for their coworkers. I really learned what it meant to be a proletarian feminist in part through these women. And to speak boldly, to speak my mind, to take a proletarian class stand at every single turn on the shop floor, because man, the class struggle is playing out continuously when you work a working class job. And especially if you're a steward, like, all you're doing is sizing up continuously, like, how do I take a proletarian stand? And it's hard, and you don't always do it, but you have to learn from those mistakes as well. So there were a lot of women that taught me a lot about what it meant to be bold. And I was gifted this bracelet by a few Dominicans at my Amazon workplace. I was told that I was a Latina at heart. I'm not Latina, I'm Black, but they told me that because in their mind, like, the boldness with which I spoke and the stance that I was taking was in line with the way that women culturally, in especially the DR, are encouraged to, I guess, operate. And that shouldn't be overly generalized, but there is a thing there, a real social phenomenon of women from the Dominican Republic being pretty bold and pretty outspoken. So anyways, I guess that's just a little bit of a preface here. But I do want to
say that's something that, in my experience organizing at a big grocery store chain, was very much the case. I worked with a lot of Dominicanas, and they were very fierce fighters. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, the outspokenness, it just can't be understated. Okay, let's transition into workplace harassment. So this happened at both UPS and Amazon to myself and other women, and mainly women, as like that I was privy to. And this was not something, this issue of workplace harassment was not something I was able to successfully galvanize women around. And I want to highlight this for a few reasons, and I'll get into all of the reasons. First of all, the problem of passivity in the face of harassment. Women have been told to put up with patriarchal treatment from literally every corner of society since they were born, and for every year of their life since they were born. They're told to deal with it. They're provided very little recourse. Never mind, do they have many examples of what militant opposition to patriarchy looks like. So they're systematically encouraged to be passive in the face of this oppression. So it's just no wonder that it's this massive uphill battle to get women to take a stand against workplace harassment. There's that. Then there's women who, which is linked to passivity, but is a little bit distinct, who are afraid of taking stands against harassment. And this is because of their material experience, which teaches them to be afraid of this. I've seen time and time again reports that women have filed on harassment, gone overlooked, myself included, and seen supervisors instead protected. And then after they write these reports, women are harassed to a greater degree in the workplace, either by that particular supervisor in a sexual fashion, or just harassed by being called crazy or being told that they're the problem. In essence, like this patriarchal logic just applied to these women very intensely after they take a stand. And then that leads, and it has led to, very unfortunately, women, especially in Amazon, starting to come to work less. And some women that just quit. And then if they don't, they will have their job threatened for taking the stand or for the potential of taking the stand. And I want to make a point here because this fear can be overcome. It can, and it has been. There's a similar fear that exists just generally among the working class for taking stands, right? Like it's not just exclusive to workplace harassment. People do have a fear of taking a stand against a wage cut, of taking a stand against, introduction of automation, of different things that lead to the reduction in the quality of the workplace environment because they're afraid of losing their job. But we have seen workers time and time again also overcome this fear to take a stand. So I think something that's important to see here is the dialectical relationship between that general struggle against the oppression of workers on the shop floor and its unity with the struggle against the particular oppression of women on the shop floor. Historically, it's just been proven that and like shown time and time again, while, there can be trends that break from this, but generally it takes first galvanizing the workforce, the entire workforce, around an issue that generally affects them, such as, like I was saying, like introduction of automation, wage cut, to then be able to galvanize workers around particular issues that specific sections of the workforce face, such as racism and how that manifests on the shop floor, or the oppression of women on the shop floor. And the reason for that, I think, is because once workers are able to unify in a really important way, all of the workers, they have a greater ability to then see the need for unity in the face of struggles that don't necessarily pertain to the whole workforce. Because a part of that unity is the particular subsections of people within that unity. So once they take that stand, that they prove to themselves in practice, okay, we're capable of taking this stand, we are stronger for taking this stand, then they're able to address the problems of the particular oppression of women. And this has really just been proven through like 100+ years of labor union organizing and by what communists have synthesized. So I guess I'm making this point to say, like, there wasn't a lively movement at my workplace at either UPS or Amazon. I guess more scientifically, I wouldn't say movement, but just like there wasn't a lot of struggle playing out. There wasn't a lot of organization. I tried to get workers to be a part of a unit of organization at both workplaces. It was hard. And then, we carried out some struggles against some issues, like taking away our headphones at Amazon, for example, at UPS, just like the terrible working conditions. There's just too many examples to give. But like, it wasn't ever the case that we had a sustained organization and unity among the workforce to struggle for against different manifestations of oppression. So without that, there just wasn't going to be an ability to really have a successful struggle against workplace harassment.
That's well said. Can I jump in on that point?
Jump in.
Because as you know, back, I guess about 8 years ago now, the precursor to Maoist Communist Union was Mass Proletariat. And I was involved in that organization. Myself and another comrade went into a call center to organize. And this was exactly the experience that we had. And I just want to paint a picture first and then talk a little bit about some of the particulars. So This call center was a few hundred workers. The call center typically hired generally two types of workers, not always, but or I guess there's a few types of people, but they in particular hired a lot of people who had a past conviction, who therefore were like really struggling to get a job. So people would be very worried about their economic security and really not stand out and not struggle. And a lot of single mothers. And just to be like extremely clear about what happened is generally in the hiring process itself, people would be pressured into sexual favors to get the job. Women would be pressured into this. Then managers would demand that throughout the course of the time there. There was rampant sexual harassment. It was often tied up with racial oppression. I remember one white manager at a team building night where he took his team out drinking, told one of my black coworkers that she was like the slave at work. And he said, you know what that means? And winked at her. Yeah. And she freaked out. She's like, what the fuck? She left the team building night. She was involved in some of the organizing committee activities. We talked about this. We tried to galvanize other people around it. And people weren't willing to move on these things. They were like, oh, that's fucked up. That guy's a racist. Everyone knows that. He sucks. But people weren't willing to move on it in the sense of really organize around it. And that was tough. It was very hard on her. It was very hard on others. We had a lot of coworkers just daily facing this sort of harassment. And it wore on people. And a lot of women who were working there, they would start off working there and they'd be kind of positive. Oh, it's a call center. It's kind of an office job. You know, that's a little better. And then a few weeks in or a few months in, people would be like wake and bake every single day smoking. People start drinking on the job because they just feel just crushed by this bullshit. And really hurt, honestly, and saddened by the fact that the other women, especially, but also the men in the workplace, wouldn't take a stand with them. And that went on for months when I was there. But eventually a big struggle started. We kind of helped to spark this, but basically it was uncovered that there was bed bugs in the workplace, and the company had been covering this up for months, and people kept getting bitten. People were getting sick, like blood poisoning from the bed bugs, and they were spraying these chemicals that just made it smell horrible in there, made everyone feel very nauseous. And this all came out. And so our organizing committee got together a basic petition and posted it in the break room against the bed bugs, demanding the company close the office, deal with the bed bugs, apologize to people, blah, 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 rehire anyone who lost their job because they missed work because of bed bugs. That was common. And when we did that, we had a big meeting actually after that petition was posted, and all this stuff, this, you know, for some people who've been there for years of just frustrations around racism and patriarchy in particular just came pouring out. All these stories, people had just, they hadn't forgotten. They kind of, as a survival tactic, effectively shoved that stuff down, gone to work, gritted their teeth, been like, fuck this manager, not said much. But once the struggle picked up a bit, and then it eventually picked up to a decent amount, honestly, we ended up shutting down the workplace for a day in a kind of semi-spontaneous strike when they tried to fire, actually me. And the struggle continued for about 11 months after that. We were ultimately defeated, but there's a whole thing to be said there. But once that like dam was broken, it was like a watershed moment. And just this flood of people's grievances and bitterness came pouring out, and people were really able to stand together and expose different stuff and support each other in the struggles. Some of these key racist managers were fired as people like went back through chat logs and took screenshots, because we used like a chat, Google Chats or something, I forget what it was. And people reported instances, and it was just like this outpouring of solidarity in this struggle. And there was a very small struggle, in effect, a few hundred workers at a call center that was ultimately defeated. And there was a lot of lessons we learned as communists in that struggle. And we made a lot of mistakes, to be clear. We were far from perfect in leading the struggle. It was very early on in our organization's history. But you can see in a bigger scale this phenomena in the Chinese Revolution, for example, a much bigger scale, like qualitatively bigger than one small call center struggle, where the Chinese communists, in the course of the agrarian revolution, would have these speak bitterness campaigns, where the peasants would come out and speak their bitterness, sometimes literally generations of bitterness of how the landlords had oppressed them, and especially around patriarchy, because in the feudal society, the patriarchal oppression that women faced was just very intense. I mean, foot binding, kind of basically people having to give their children over into slavery to the landlords to cover feudal debts and so on. And just, it's a very important lesson for communists to remember that the people don't forget these things. They may be downtrodden right now. They may be basically feeling that they have no alternative but to grit their teeth and bear this bullshit. And that may only manifest sometimes in individual outbursts of rebellion, where people are like, you know, fuck you, and I hate this place, and you're racist and sexist, and I quit, and storm out. And we, you know, if you've worked a working class job, you've seen one or another person do that. But when the struggle picks up, the working class all their grievances, like I said, generations of them come out. And it's just very important to not fall into the empiricist tendency. That's very common, especially say amongst like third worldist articulations or people who are really pessimistic about the present state of the working class movement in the US or other imperialist countries, who say, oh, those workers, they don't care about patriarchy. They don't care about racism. They don't care about those things. They just want to have a middle class life. It's really not true. Of course, there are some workers who feel that way, but we cannot confuse the appearance from the low level of struggle with the essence of the class, of the proletariat's class interest. And every time the struggle heightens, you see that essence and that true class interest in overcoming all forms of oppression just come pouring out. And it's in those struggles that we can unleash the fury of woman as a mighty force in the making of revolution.
So well said. And like your example of the call center, I think gets at very well this dialectic between the struggle, the unity of the workforce against a particular economic issue, and then the struggle against the particular oppression that women face or some manifestation of it. And then, of course, the Chinese Revolution example is just always an excellent example to give. I want to make a point that bleeds well into the one that you ended off on, which is that this relates more to my particular experience in Amazon, but I'll draw out a larger point from it. There was a difference between the proletarian men that I was organizing with on the shop floor and their willingness to take a stand against women oppression, the oppression of women, either, workplace harassment or otherwise, and those men that were wavering on the union project, on the need for a union, whatever. I think that the important point to make here is that those that really took up the spirit of a union and not the BS class collaborationist idea of a union didn't toe the line of the leaders, like people that really understood what it meant for there to be unity, at least on the level of the working class, against their economic oppression, against the basic brutality that they faced on the shop floor. Those people that understood that in the Teamsters, and then those people that really wanted to fight for a union, were always willing to take a stand for harassment on the shop floor. It never materialized, to be clear. Like we never
stand against, right?
Oh, brutal. Yeah, I mean against. Yeah, to take a stand against harassment on the shop floor. We never actually got a struggle going, but they were willing to. They said they wanted to get that going. They'd go and talk to women that have had these different experiences with piggish supervisors. It wasn't possible to get going, but there was the willingness. And I think the kind of underlying thing there is like this baseline understanding of the need for organization among the working class to defend against the attacks of capital compels men and women alike, but men in particular I'm talking about here, to see the need to fight against patriarchy on the shop floor. This is to say, union consciousness, if it's true union consciousness, not the BS that's being propagated, often compels workers to fight for the economic needs of women too, at the very bare minimum. And there's more to say here. And I think this point actually takes us well into the next point about the unions.
Yeah, well, just to say, and then once that with that, basic trade union consciousness, that's a starting point for communists, not the ending point. If workers see that, then we can build far beyond that if we handle the struggle correctly, and if we really carry out our duty as communists to raise the class consciousness of the working class. So I believe the next point is the challenges in the unions that are boys clubs, which, I see you wearing that Teamsters shirt right now, so you're well qualified to talk about.
I am indeed. I went head to head with the boys club many times, as did many other women comrades of mine. I'll start off with the general point here, which kind of relates to the last point that I was making that you were making too, Ryan, about the proletarian perspective on unions versus a bourgeois perspective. There are people out there, I think, that conflate unions with the dominant share of those that are in leadership of the unions, the class collaborationists, and for that reason reject unions. We utterly oppose that line. Unions are just this incredible unit of organization for the working class, and we need to win leadership away from the misleaders of the unions. And by we, I mean the communists, in unity with the working class. So that's a general point there, which bleeds well into this more particular point, which is that there are a lot of patriarchal men that are in leadership of the unions. These are the class collaborationists. It's no coincidence that they're also extremely patriarchal. Not, there's some that kind of take up more progressive tinges, but there's, in the Teamsters especially, there are a lot of patriarchal men that are in leadership. And because of that fact, I think a lot of like radical liberals and even some people that say they're communists will say that, well, the unions just equal patriarchy or something. That's like kind of the logic there. But it's just not at all the truth. As I said, these are units of organization that are incredibly crucial for the liberation of the working class, but also for the women's liberation, for the movement for women's liberation, albeit a limited role the unions will play. They won't play the role that a communist party can play because they only can go so far since they aren't political organizations, but they will play some role. And it really will be a matter of the communists involving themselves in the unions to be able to push the unions in the correct direction, like along that revolutionary trajectory. Anywho, what I'm saying is the proletarian perspective on unions here. And this is a perspective that many men and women alike have taken up throughout history, that communists especially have really spearheaded. But then they've been able to galvanize, more progressive sections of the unions in order to fight for equal wages between the sexes and the like. To be utterly clear, it is the reactionary labor union leaders and their bourgeois perspective on the unions that blunts the struggle against women's oppression. It is these leaders that uphold patriarchy and these leaders that constitute what we're calling the boys' club. But as I already said, we can't conflate the union as a whole organization that, encompasses millions of workers with just these leaders. And of course, that organization that encompasses those millions of workers in particular have an interest, a class interest in opposing women's oppression, standing for women's liberation, and standing for their own liberation as a class, which requires standing for women's liberation. So those are some general points. I can go into some particulars now too, but I wanted to see if you wanted to say anything, Ryan. If not, I'll just keep going.
Well, yeah, that's well said. I just want to say, it's helpful to think really of the unions fundamentally as another arena of class struggle. It's an organization for the working class, but which the bourgeoisie presently dominates in the US. And so, like you said, we've got to drive them out. And part of that driving them out is exposing actually how insufficient the stand they take is on so many different social issues. Now, that's often not the thing that will immediately galvanize people against them. Like, for example, in the UPS contract struggle, the key exposures that we made as MCU in the course of that struggle pertain to just how the leadership wasn't even doing the basics they said they were doing, how the contract was a sellout contract, how they were promising that they were going to win victories they weren't winning, how they didn't meet the demands that the workers had. But as the working class movement develops, and as the class consciousness of the workers is raised by communists, it becomes possible to show them how insufficient the leadership of the unions is on almost every major social issue, and the reactionaries are. And it's a very complicated process, actually, the historical process of driving out the reactionaries out of leadership of the unions, and more broadly, winning over the working class movement to communist leadership. And I see some people asking questions in the comments. They're good questions of how to avoid the dual union mistake while also driving the reactionaries out and not getting kicked out. It's a complex question. We've written a few documents on this that I'd encourage comrades to read. On the other hand, there's a lot of particulars in each country, and it's really a matter of absorbing as much historical experience as we can of communist work in the union movement to understand how to navigate all sorts of different complicated situations. I know that's a bit of a digression from the main thrust of the point of the live stream today, but it's just essential that communists be very, very well studied on revolutionary theory in general. Lenin makes this point on left-wing communism, but in particular on how to lead the working class movement and all the twists and turns and all the different tactics and strategies the bourgeoisie will use to discredit communists in the working class movement so that we can stand strong. And this is not, in a sense, a separate question from the fight for the emancipation of women, insofar as the fight for the emancipation of women is inextricably tied up with the fight to overthrow the capitalist and to end class society. We need to be square in how to win over leadership of the working class movement. And in particular, a key component of that is the winning over of the women workers and the galvanizing of male workers to fight against patriarchy?
It's an important digression, to be clear. And I think, bleeds well into a point that I wanted to make, which is very related. That, okay, like we need the labor unions to fight against the oppression of women. They are hubs of very important sections of the working class. They are going to be important units, or rather organizations, in the class struggle, and not just in the class struggle on the shop floor, not just in political movements, you know, for laws that regard the working class, but in the emancipation of the working class as well. That doesn't mean that every union is necessarily going to be a red union before revolution, but I don't want to get too much into this question here, as Ryan was saying. But they need to wage a fight against the oppression of women. They need to basically be pushed in that direction. You know, to an extent, they can take up those stands without the influence of communists, but history has proven that they really can't, that they just have not been able to do this. And I have a few examples to give along these lines. So, for example, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, that leadership refused to, at many points throughout its history, I'm thinking specifically of like the 1910s, 20s, 30s, they refused to bring women from the skilled trades into the unions. It was communists that entered into the established unions that were a part of the AFL to make progress. It took them to actually make progress on the incorporation of women into the unions. And then women who were at the time, and still like majority in the unskilled trades, were for the most part not organized. And then what happens? The CIO was created, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which took the leadership of communists to create, which split off from the AFL in 1935 specifically, I think. It was the CIO that then organized these women that were in the unskilled trades and brought just like hundreds of thousands of women into the union. A massive wave especially entered during World War II, when women went into industrial production in greater numbers than they had before. And it's important to say, like, okay, communists fought for the incorporation of women into the unions. They didn't just fight for the incorporation of women into unions, but they fought for basic economic demands that women really needed in that period of time. They fought against women's oppression in that sense. They backed demands for equal pay with their male counterparts, childcare services, etc. And it was really through the communist leadership in the unions that they were able to do this. And it's no wonder that some of the most leading militant and advanced unions on the women's question in the 1930s was the United Electrical Workers, which was led by communists in that period of time. So the point that I'm making here is that the unions have proven throughout history to not, without the help of communists and a communist party, be able to link up to really struggle against women's oppression, firstly. And then they will not, and they absolutely will not, be able to link up the struggle against women's oppression with the struggle against the general oppression of the working class and realization of the revolutionary road. So hopefully that gives you some sense of what's played out in history. It really is going to be an uphill battle to do this, to have communist influence in the unions. As Ryan was saying, this is not just like a smooth trajectory we're talking about here. It's not something that we have a perfect idea of how it needs to play out. We have lessons from history, and we should apply what has played out in history, the very positive examples that exist, and also learn by negative example in order to be able to chart a path forward here. But the underlying message here that I'm trying to get across is that it has taken communists to, in the unions, be able to influence the unions in the direction of fighting against women's oppression, but not just stop at the oppression of women that the oppression that women face under capitalism, but then also to have that struggle be along the lines, or I guess in line with the struggle to emancipate the working class as a whole.
In order for the revolutionary movement to succeed, those have to move in lockstep, actually. And, you know, especially now with the lessons that we have from the Russian and Chinese revolutions, and as well as a whole bunch of other struggles for women's liberation, including especially the advances in the last few decades in India and the Philippines, we really have a tremendous amount of historical knowledge at our disposal as communists to draw on. on how to draw women into the struggle and bring them into positions of leadership in the struggle, both in the working class movement broadly and in communist organizations more specifically. And it's really incumbent upon communists to take this incredibly seriously. Basically, failing to take this seriously, as you already noted, is at least, at minimum, a step on the road to revisionism, if not a huge fucking leap on that road. And organizations have seen it time and time again. When they don't take it seriously, it leads to real big problems, which go far beyond the problem of just not dealing with patriarchy seriously. So there's more to say on this topic. That said, I think there's some other topics you wanted to touch on about the stuff in UPS and in particular the contract struggle there. So we should get into those a little bit before we wrap up.
Yeah, I can share just a few examples of going head to head with the boys club. That's what I was thinking of ending.
Yeah, that really brings it to life. And every time I see Sean O'Brien, it really he gives that impression so much of like the meathead.
Yes,
So
meathead,
and no offense to meatheads out there, I don't really want to say you're all like Sean O'Brien.
An important disclaimer. Yeah, okay, so I can just share a couple of things. First off, the comrades in MCU that went into the Teamsters, of which there are still a few that are in the Teamsters, we were all women. And that is just pretty fucking cool. It really speaks to, I think, the organizational standard we have, which is to really raise women up and see them as serious communist leaders. So that's just something I want to say first and foremost. The experiences I faced in going head to head with the boys club, all of my fellow women comrades also faced. And I also watched other women face as well. So I have a few examples here to start. During the UPS contract struggle, there were very few people that were willing to actually take a stand against the sellout contract. But there were two women that were willing to do that. And I worked with them closely in the lead up to the contract vote. The first woman, I met her because I went to the local union meeting after the sellout contract was proposed. And she was told by the union leadership to stop bitching when she was complaining about the contract. Not just complaining, rightfully agitating against the contract and the BS in that contract. And she got up on the mic to do so, and she was told to stop. So I made contact with her. I took a stand against that in the meeting, of course, and I made contact with her. And we started working together about, how can we get out some materials on the issues in the contract. And those materials that we were using were from an organization that I was a part of when I was in the Teamsters called Teamsters Mobilized, which is like this grassroots militant organization in the Teamsters Union fighting against class collaborationism. So her and I, we went to her building with this other woman, and we were handing out flyers against the contract. And we knew what we were up against. This was the largest hub in our local. I think there were 6 stewards just in this one building, which is a lot.
Do you give a sense, like, how big is the hub? How many people work there?
Hundreds of people. And, there's fulfillment centers in Amazon that are thousands of people that are larger than this hub. But it was a pretty big hub for UPS standards, I think, or at least for our area. Hundreds of workers, though. And we decide we're going to fly her outside of the morning shift. And so we get out there and, we know there's these 6 stewards. They're all men. And, they all toe the line of the union leadership. That's not a guarantee for stewards, but a lot of stewards end up just being kind of the agents of the local union leadership. So we know that they're all pro-contract. We know that they know that we'll be there. And yet we stand outside the doors and we hand out those flyers with so much confidence, trying to win people over to see this contract. It doesn't make sense. It's not for us. We need to oppose it. You need to vote no. We've got vote no stickers and pins all over us. And we're speaking very militantly. And this is one of these moments I was referencing halfway through this live stream, talking about just like how impressed I was by some of the women that I was in contact with on the shop floor. I was honestly like inspired and pushed even further to just be quite militant in that moment because of the stand that these 2 other women that were with me were taking. And anyway, so, the goons come out, the stewards, and even people that weren't stewards in this building, like they're just sending like people to spy on us that are stewards from other buildings. And they do not come up to us. I think because we were an intimidating presence and clearly winning people over through just our little agitational speeches talking about the contract, but they're just like a hawk in a very predatory fashion, circling us, trying to intimidate us, but it's not working. And by the end of the day, we end up running out of all of our flyers, had a bunch of encouraging discussions, and leave. And they couldn't intimidate us for a second. So that's one story. Then I guess there's just this.
Just to say, it sounds like not only could they not intimidate you, but that you all intimidated them. Actually, they didn't. And like, you know, just to say that for some of the people who don't know, some of the Teamsters people, you know, they have a history. I don't know these particular people, but they've got a history tied up with the mob and Hoffa. And there's some business agents who are, you know, intimidating, to put it mildly. So it's not a small feat to stand up like this, and people may not quite realize that. I just want to emphasize that.
It is not a coincidence that a lot of these stewards end up being like 6 foot tall, very large men who at our local union meetings wear suits and have massive badges on their chest and stand around the local union hall meeting room to look out for anybody that could stand out in opposition to the local union leadership. They are chosen because ideologically they align with the local union leadership, but then they also just look very intimidating. Like they are meant to be security guards of the local union leadership. So yeah, to Ryan's point, like these men are pretty scary looking. But you are absolutely right. We did intimidate them. And I had one interaction with one of these goons before I left where he tried to come up to my car to tell me to stop or to try to intimidate me. And I forgot his name. And so I called him like 2 or 3 other names before I called him his right name. And I accidentally called this man, who was like a pretty fit 6 foot tall man, the name of someone who was very overweight and like 5 foot something. And he got very offended and then got very blush.
You really hurt his ego there. He's like, I'm big and strong. What are you saying?
Exactly. And it was a genuine mistake, but I was happy for the slip up, honestly, because it threw him off. And then he couldn't intimidate me. And then he got very nervous. And then I was like, I'm just going to leave. So I left. Yeah. So, okay, that's one story. And then there's just this general air of patriarchy, right? You know, I go to the local union hall meetings. I'm one of maybe like 10 women there, and there will be, I don't know, like 100 plus people at meetings on average, 100 to 200 maybe. And that's not because there aren't women in the union. Like there are women in the union, maybe not as much on average in the local as men, but there are way more women than the ratio that's being represented at the local union meetings. But it's because it's so freaking intimidating to be there. Like you mainly have men that are up at the mantle or like, you know, at this massive podium, like you're at church, that are talking down to you and they don't let anyone speak. To equate it with church is not inaccurate in ways. So anyway, so really intimidating air. And, you know, I became a steward, and I became a steward because I took a pretty large stand in the local union meeting. That was, I think, the largest meeting we had that year. And our general president, Sean O'Brien, happened to be there at the meeting. And I made a speech, which nobody does. And I didn't know that nobody did that until I did it. And they couldn't shut me up because I was able to win over like the whole room. And I was talking about the oppression I was facing on the shop floor, just all these different issues, like raise your hand if you've had to deal with a shitty supervisor, raise your hand if you don't think you get paid enough, you know, all these things. And people are like raising their hands. And then I think I said, clap if you've experienced this or that. And some people are making noise now and eating it up. And so, you know, I conclude my agitational speech and the president gets on the mic and he's like, I can just feel Peter's, no, what did he say? Yeah, I can see like fume coming out of Peter's ears behind me without even having to look at him. Peter was a business agent for my building.
So he was saying that Peter was pissed that you gave the speech.
Yes, that's what he was saying. But then he was like, I liked it. So contradictions among the union leadership. Peter was very mad. And I would later find that out when he would come up to me, and he would be my business agent while I was a steward. So basically I make this speech then they're like, okay, we got to control this girl. So they make me a steward because they think they can do that better by making me steward. It's just, and that doesn't end up happening, of course.
And just to say, it's not an accident you said they can control this girl when you're in fact not a girl but a woman, but that's how they think of you.
Yeah, exactly. That's how they viewed me, though. They viewed me as a little girl. And that came out in several different ways. But yeah, so I made a steward because I think they can keep a cap on me a bit better. It doesn't end up working. And me and Peter, the business agent, are just going head to head, like every other day. And, you know, I think the major thing was that he opposed my class ideology. You know, he opposed the politics that I stood for and the stance that I was taking as a result of that. But there was an important dimension of him also just being incredibly misogynistic. And so he would, in these debates, just try to make me feel so stupid, try to throw comments at me like, you don't understand the contract, you can't understand the contract, you can't understand this, cut me off a lot. And I'm sure that there was also like a racial factor to this too. He was also pretty insecure. He was like a fairly white passing Latino man who didn't know Spanish, and I know Spanish. And so when he would try to come around to our shop floor, and he would try to spew a bunch of BS, I would tell him, hold on, let me translate for the workforce. So that made him feel insecure. But then what I would say is normally he's talking crap, like everything he's saying is wrong. Here's the real crap, like, you know, here's really what's going on, and agitate a bit in Spanish. And he had no idea what was going on. And that made him feel pretty bad about himself. So anyways, he had a very disparaging view of me.
Just to say real quick before you go further, it's an important lesson. It was a big thing in my workplace organizing experience too, to be able to speak, especially in the US, to be able to speak Spanish in working class workplaces. It's really, really important for Marxist organizers. Like, you need to be able to talk to people in Spanish, generally speaking. And there's some workplaces with other languages, but so much of the US proletariat is Spanish speaking.
Yeah, absolutely, Ryan. And like, it's very important for combating American arrogance as well. I think the attitude that people have, given the hegemony of English internationally, it's so important for that. It's so important for being able to connect with those coworkers on the shop floor, and for just to connect with the second largest language speaking population in this country, to learn from the people, whatever. So it's incredibly important. I definitely agree. But yeah, so he felt pretty insecure. And, you know, there was this interesting thing that relates to the contradiction among the union leadership, which was that most of them were of the Hoffa conservatism. So very opposed to the trend of identity politics today, didn't care for it, very openly like racist, misogynistic, very against even like on some level, like the TDU progress in the union, which was on a basic level, what was actually progress was the democratic vote. But TDU is aligned with Sean O'Brien. They are also promoters of class collaborationism, and they work hand in glove.
For those who don't know, we talked about TDU, Teamsters for a Democratic Union, in the last live stream on the work in the Teamsters. They were a reform caucus in the union started by like some Trotskyists back in the 70s that in the last election sold out and joined O'Brien's campaign. Not that they were revolutionary before, but they did fight for some basic reform. But with the election of Sean O'Brien, they've become a total establishment force in the Teamsters. And if you want to learn more, check out the last live stream. Keep going.
Yeah, no, that's a great plug. And yeah, thank you for breaking down TDU. I fell into just saying the acronym without explaining it. But yeah, so my point is that there's this conservative trend among the union leaders nationally, but then also locally, this was the case. And then this minority current of trying to adapt to identity politics. So though it was underlined by just the same racism, the same misogyny, just with this kind of convenient mask on it, which is true in society at large. It's not just the case for the union leaders. But the way that this worked was that I, by like the union president, was seen as this outspoken girl specifically, and also a woman of color, or also a girl of color. So like, because of that, we have to prop her up. We both have to put a cap on her, but we also have to prop her up, but then we can't prop her up too much because, you know, we don't want her speaking in her militant tongue. So they had to wrestle with that contradiction. The way that this thing would play out normally is that, like, most of the conservatives would say, you know, we don't care for her. Why is she being put in positions of leadership, like being a steward? We should just get rid of her, which ultimately they ended up doing. They ended up firing me from everything. But, you know, the minority trend that took up identity politics were like, we need to prop her up, so let's do it in very obviously hollow ways. And this would not just happen to me, it would happen to other people of color in the union. And what would happen is that like we'd be put on stages, but then not given the ability to speak, or we'd be highlighted in different ways in union meetings, but then the content of like what I would say in specific would not be highlighted. And then as soon as I didn't toe, well, I never did toe the reactionary union leaders line, but once I came out really more sharply, and like us as communists and MCU came out more sharply, and also the more militant union workers came out more sharply against the contract. Once that happened, all of my opportunities were immediately taken away from me. So as I said, I was fired from everything.
Just to be clear, you weren't fired from UPS, right? But you were fired from your positions in the union.
I was fired from my positions in the union. Yeah, the union doesn't control employment.
Yeah.
But they can also try to make your life a living hell, like the union leaders, if they really want to. And they did do that for me. There was a lot of support I also got from union members in this regard. And it just speaks to the utility of the union here and why we also have to oppose misleadership of the union. I had some basic protections being in the union that the union wasn't trying to take away from me entirely, or like the union leadership wasn't trying to take away from me entirely. And then I had union members on the shop floor that were standing with me in the face of them trying to fire me as a steward, for example, the union leadership, or to fire me as an Amazon organizer, which really just speaks to the hope that exists, I think, for the non-communist working class masses to really take pretty important stands against the repression against communists by union leaders, even in our reactionary period today. So I don't know, I kind of just like went down a couple different routes here, but that's all I got.
Well, just to say, judging by the reactions in the chat, people really loved it. And I agree, it was fantastic. And just to say, I saw one of the comments of Spartacus Bund asking about like, how do we deal with this question of potentially being driven out of the unions? And we don't have a comprehensive answer in MCU. But I think what you just spelled out there, Maya, is pretty concrete in terms of how we've handled some aspects of this, and drawing on the initiative and opposition of the rank and file union members to this sort of stuff. And I know comrades in Germany and in the MLPD specifically have dealt with a lot of repression and efforts to drive them out of the unions and different things like that. So there's also a rich history in amongst anti-revisionist parties still today going on around the world in industrial countries, industrialized societies, of how to fight for communist leadership of the unions. And that's very important to learn from as well. And us at MCU have only begun to really investigate those experiences more systematically in the last year or so. But there's an incredible rich tradition there to learn from. And we hope to continue to learn from it and to build our own experience, really. And I think on the one hand, what you've laid out here is incredibly rich. I also want to emphasize how we still have so much to learn. And there's just a long and difficult road ahead for the revolutionary movement really to develop in the US right now, as it's still a marginal trend and not really properly speaking a movement. But the basic orientation that you've laid out here, well, first, there's some important general lessons, but there's also a basic orientation, really, of taking the general lessons that we already have from the communist theory and history and applying them and bring them to bear on our situations in front of us. And that's essential. It's the only way forward, really. So with that said, we're going to be closing out the live stream soon. I think just the last topic, we were going to both share a few quotes, or one quote each, right? And really, before we do that, I just want to emphasize that the struggle against patriarchy, and we already said this, but is just essential, not only to overcome patriarchy, but to get the participation of more women in the movement, in the revolutionary movement, in the working class movement more broadly, in communist organizations, to lift women up into the strong fighters that they can be. Without this, organizations and movements will be hamstrung. And it sounds basic and it sounds simple. In a certain sense, it is, just taking this stuff seriously. On the other hand, given the strength of the bourgeois ideology and the patriarchal ideology the bourgeoisie promotes, it's a non-trivial matter. It's something that that organizations and individuals need to take up actively, not passively. They need to actively take up the study of the experiences of how other communist organizations around the world have done this. They need to take up study of the history of patriarchy and how it's developed, and the struggles under socialism to overcome it, as even though we're not under socialism, those still have a lot of relevance for us today. And without doing this, inevitably, the void of our ignorance will be filled in spontaneously by the dominant ideology of the ruling class, which is a patriarchal ideology. And there's not like a neutral position we have from ignorance. And that applies to other oppressive forms of thinking like racism and so on as well. And it's just important to remember that the process of transformation of consciousness, including the transformation of our own consciousness, is an active process, one which unites theory and practice, not a passive process.
So well said. Okay, I'm going to read my quote now.
Amazing.
Anuradha Gandhi from Scripting the Change. Here we go. The revisionists and bourgeois liberals seek to dampen the woman's spirit of freedom, displaying mock concern, acting as condescending saviors, confining women to their home. They compromise with patriarchal values, feudal traditions, and fear of women's emancipation and assertion. They, of course, also celebrate Women's Day as a routine, issuing out the regular hypocritical statements. It is the revolutionary forces throughout the world, and more particularly the Maoists, who have brought back a living vibrancy to the International Working Women's Day, making it, once again, a day symbolizing the struggle of women for freedom, self-respect, equality, and emancipation from all patriarchal values and exploitative practices. It is this revolutionary spirit that kindles a new hope in the future for the oppressed women of India and the world. I'll just leave it there. It's just such an amazing quote.
It's so powerful. And I'll just say briefly, well, two things. In that same essay, I believe she talks about the efforts by the ruling classes to reduce women to the triad of daughter, wife, mother, as if those are the only roles that women can play in society, which is pretty dark and obviously a very patriarchal view of women. Second, what she references there about the vibrancy of the International Working Women's Day coming back with the revival of revolutionary forces and the expansion of the Maoist movement in particular in India and the Philippines is really worth thinking about, especially for comrades in imperialist countries. And not just there, actually, but the spread of the NGOs and the bourgeois feminism through the UN and other things has really created the myth that Maya already talked about, that it's the bourgeoisie itself and the so-called progressive intellectuals, some of whom are somewhat progressive, who really brought the women's issue to the center of public consciousness. It's just historical revisionism. And this sort of view can only persist because of our collective amnesia about the true history of the women's movement and the struggle to overthrow capitalism and to establish a classless society in their inextricable link. And so therefore, to fight these nefarious lies, which are used by anti-communist forces all around the world to discredit communists and to basically inoculate progressive sections of the petty bourgeoisie, especially those who are college educated, against communist ideology, we have to first ourselves understand the true history of International Working Women's Day and then propagate that widely. And this stream is just a modest attempt to do that, but it's a call for comrades around the world to take this up themselves. And I guess with that said, I'll read the quote that I have. So this is from an article Jan Myrdal wrote, I believe in 1975, on a trip to China. And he was talking about the collective childcare efforts there, but also just the broader impact of patriarchal ideology and how thousands of years of class society have impacted us. So it impacted people's thinking, and they need to take up that struggle under socialism against the ideas in the backs of people's mind. He says, and as far as women are concerned, it has always been said that they were intended for nothing other than looking after the home. And therefore, they should always agree with those who understand the major issues better. It has also been said that they should not only respect their elders, but also obey them. And all of this, said day after day for thousands of years, leaves an impression in the back of our minds. It is not just that the people are oppressed. They are also given thoughts and notions about their own worthlessness and inferiority, which oppress them. To settle accounts with that inner oppression is important. This contributes to the liberation of an enormous creative force, rich initiative, and the capacity to work together for a common goal. For thousands of years, these qualities had been suppressed by long-standing prejudices about inferiority, obedience, geniuses, and the people's backwardsness. Now, Myrdal is talking here not only about patriarchy, but about all the different oppressive ideas that weigh on the people. Thousands of years of these ideas being promoted. But in particular, he's talking about patriarchy here and the way in which women have internalized the ideas of their own inferiority. And that's very, very important to think about how as communists, we work to empower women, in particular women in the working class movement, to really see their own capacities and to think about not just how the immediate men who have been shitty to them in their lives, or women who have reinforced these ideas, have affected them, but how literally, again, thousands of years of tradition, people saying this stuff over and over and over and over again, weigh on people. And to really see our fight then as the fight against that cultural legacy of class society, and the work we're doing now in a small way, and then hopefully in the future in a bigger way, as contributing to the creation of a new society where these ideas are seen as the disgusting drivel that they truly are, and looked at as a historical relic of a dark past.
Absolutely, Ryan. And I guess just one closing comment. So International Working Women's Day is tomorrow. We need to understand the history behind that specific day. We need to celebrate this day. But to the points that you've made, Ryan, we need to not just understand the particular history behind International Working Women's Day, nor just the day in particular and celebrate this proletarian feminism on this specific day. We have to understand the rich history, communist history, of fighting for women's emancipation and the link between that and the emancipation of the proletariat as a whole, and that leading to the course of the emancipation of humanity as a whole. We need to understand the lessons that communists have gathered from their role in waging a struggle against women's oppression. We need to understand the particular way, scientifically understand the particular way that patriarchy is propped up under capitalism. And we also need to understand, as you put it, the cultural legacy of patriarchy across all modes of production that have been established under class society. And through that scientific understanding, we then need to apply that to our concrete conditions. Understand what is the way forward right now as communists in America for women and for the working class to continue to carve that path out and continue to refine our understanding of what that means, to understand that on an international scale as well. And only through that true application of that understanding in real time can we really call ourselves communists, can we really call ourselves proletarian feminists. And that is what it means to carry the mantle forward of proletarian feminism.
Oh, that was so well said. Really inspiring. I got goosebumps just hearing you say that. It was really great. It's been really great having you here, Maya, having you join the stream and share your experience and your really sharp and insightful theoretical comments. We got to have you on again. So thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Ryan. I had so much fun. I was a little bit nervous. I was telling Ryan before we got on the live stream, just talking at a camera, speaking at length, it makes me a bit nervous, but I had a lot of fun. I hope people learned some things from this. I think we bounced off of each other well, and I'd love to come back.
Yeah, we'll definitely have you back sometime soon. Thank you, Maya. Thanks for everyone for joining us. And comrades, I hope you all have a wonderful International Working Women's Day and a strong fighting International Working Women's Day tomorrow. Red salute to everyone, and talk soon.
Red salute.